영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Peter Pan, Chapter 1, The Darlings. This is the story of the Darling family. It is also the story of Peter Pan, a boy who may or may not exist, depending on how old you are. The Darlings lived at number 14, a house in London, England, near Kensington Gardens. At first, the family was just Mr. George Darling and his wife, Mrs. Darling. But then their children were born. Wendy came first, then John, and then Michael. Later, Nana came to live with them. She was the children's nanny and made sure they were all well cared for. Nana was a large, no-nonsense Newfoundland dog who slept on the nursery floor. Mr. Darling was a good father and an excellent provider. During the day, he worked in the city as a banker, encouraging people to spend money wisely. He liked to work with numbers at home, too. Mr. Darling counted how much money the children cost him. How much would he have to spend on their milk and cookies? How much money would he spend on their shirts and coats? When the children caught the German measles or the mumps, he worried about the cost of medicine. But he and Mrs. Darling agreed that the children were worth every penny spent. Mrs. Darling was more concerned about her children's minds than about money. She was a lovely lady with a sweet mouth and a romantic sense of the world. Her mind was like a puzzle with many boxes, each one inside the other. Mrs. Darling thought about deep things. She worried about how her children were growing up. She knew from her own experience that when a child reaches the age of 2, childhood is beginning to end. As a young girl, Mrs. Darling had many suitors. All of them wanted to marry her. But George Darling, who was a young man at the time, asked her first. He was very smart. One day, while the other boys were walking to her house to propose, Mr. Darling took a taxi. He got there ahead of the others and won her love. She happily gave him all her kisses, except for one. This kiss was her little secret. She saved it in the right corner of her sweet mouth for a special occasion. When Mrs. Darling was busy, Nana took care of the children. Nana was a treasure. Every morning she walked the children in single file to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school. When they were well behaved, Nana walked quietly by their side. When they were naughty, she barked and pushed them back into line with her huge head. She always carried an umbrella in her mouth, just in case of rain. Mr. Darling hired Nana as a nanny because she was much cheaper than a person. Even though the neighbors might gossip about a dog working as a nanny, the idea made perfect sense to Mr. Darling. Before Nana picked up the children from school, she waited in the basement with the other nannies. They complained about having a dog among them, and the neighbors did talk, but the Darlings didn't care. Before bedtime, there was always much merriment at number 14. The children were allowed to sing and dance before going to bed. Oh, the dances were such fun. Nana barked in time with the music. The other servant, Liza, danced too. Mr. Darling watched alone and apart on the sidelines. But Mrs. Darling joined the children and spun around wildly. And sometimes she even planted her secret kiss on the cheek of one of the children. Yes, the Darling family lived very happily together until the coming of Peter Pan. Peter Pan, Chapter 2, Peter Comes to Visit. Mothers always worry about what their children are thinking. Sometimes, they imagine traveling through the minds of their sleeping children. They like to tidy up their children's thoughts for the next morning. It is like straightening up a chest of drawers. A mother folds her child's naughtiness into a small place in the back of the drawer. The better thoughts are kept in the front of the drawer, ready to be brought out the following morning. When Mrs. Darling traveled through her children's minds, she found the words Peter and Neverland. Though she couldn't quite place the names, they seemed strangely familiar to her. Mrs. Darling thought they might be from her own childhood. But now that she was a grown-up, it was hard to remember exactly what the words meant. She vaguely recalled that Peter was a little boy who lived with the fairies. He lived on an island called Neverland, the land of dreams. Every child dreams about adventures in Neverland. But Mrs. Darling, as an adult, knew that these adventures were never true. One morning, Mrs. Darling found some stray leaves on the nursery floor just inside the nursery window.
How did these leaves get here?
She asked the children.
Some nights, Peter comes to visit.
Wendy replied.
Peter is very naughty. He never cleans up after himself. He probably dropped the leaves and forgot to pick them up before he left.
When Mrs. Darling asked Wendy to tell her more about Peter, Wendy described his visits.
He comes in through the window of our nursery. He sits at the foot of my bed and sometimes plays his flute.
Unfortunately, Wendy explained, she was always asleep during Peter's visits. She didn't know how she knew about them. She just knew that Peter had surely been there. Mrs. Darling thought Wendy was only describing her dreams. The nursery was on the 3rd floor and a very long way from the ground. How could anyone possibly come through the window? This story couldn't be real. But the leaves that she found on the nursery floor were certainly real. Mrs. Darling looked at them carefully. They were unusual leaves, certainly not found anywhere in England. The veins of the leaves formed a fine skeleton of lines. The following evening was Nana's night off. While the dog went out on the town, Mrs. Darling bathed her children and tucked them into bed. Then she sang to Wendy, John, and Michael until they each fell asleep. Mrs. Darling sat down by the fire in the nursery and did her sewing. She loved to watch the children while they slept. They looked so peaceful. She, too, soon fell asleep. As she slept, Mrs. Darling had a dream about Neverland. She dreamed that a strange boy had flown far away from his home. What a strange dream for a grown-up to have. All of a sudden, the nursery window blew open. A boy, dressed in the same skeleton leaves, flew in, lightly touching down on the floor. Following him was a strange light, no bigger than someone's fist. The light darted around the room as if it were alive. It was light as dust, fairy dust. Mrs. Darling recognized the boy. He was Peter Pan. And he was just as young as he had been when she first saw him as a little girl. She remembered him now. His tiny teeth sparkled like small pearls. At the sight of him, Mrs. Darling let out a scream. Just then, Nana returned from her evening out and burst into the nursery, barking. She growled and sprang at Peter, who leapt lightly up to the window. But before he could escape, Nana grabbed Peter's shadow in her mouth. As Peter flew away, his shadow tore off from his body. Concerned for Peter, Mrs. Darling ran outside and down the street to look for him. But all she saw was a shooting star in the sky. Peter Pan, Chapter 3, An Ordinary Night. The next night started as an ordinary Friday evening. Even though it was the last time Mr. and Mrs. Darling saw their 3 children for a very long time. They were dressing for a dinner party, and Mrs. Darling was helping her husband tie his bow tie. She looked splendid in her white evening gown and a necklace George had given her. She told her husband about seeing Peter in the nursery the night before. When she described how Nana had caught his shadow, Mr. Darling laughed at the story. But when she took him to the nursery and showed him the shadow, which she had carefully folded and put in a drawer, he almost believed her. Meanwhile, Nana was getting the children ready for bed. As the baby of the family, Michael sometimes made a fuss.
I won't take a bath. I won't. And I won't go to bed.
He would shout. Tonight, when it came time for his medicine, Michael refused to take it. Michael ran from the bathroom into the nursery, and Nana followed with his spoonful of medicine held carefully between her teeth. John and Wendy were right behind. When Mr. and Mrs. Darling saw the problem, Mrs. Darling went straight to the kitchen for a chocolate to sweeten the taste of the medicine. Mr. Darling was much more strict.
Be brave,
He commanded Michael.
When I was your age, I took medicine without a word. I even thanked my parents for giving me medicine to make me well.
Trying to be helpful, Wendy interrupted.
You still take medicine too, don't you, Father?
It was true, and even though Mr. Darling wanted Michael to be brave, it was also true that he didn't like his medicine. He often found reasons not to take it.
It's much nastier than Michael's,
He said.
and if I hadn't lost the bottle, I would take it now to show you how I do it, Michael.
In fact, Mr. Darling hadn't actually lost the medicine. He had hidden the bottle at the back of the medicine cabinet,
I know where it is, Father.
said Wendy. She was always a helpful daughter.
I'll bring it to you.
She ran off before he could stop her. Wendy returned with the medicine in a glass. It was a white liquid that looked like milk. Mr. Darling shuddered when he saw it.
Michael first.
He said,
Father first.
responded Michael.
It isn't fair.
Mr. Darling complained.
There is more medicine in my glass than in Michael's spoon.
Father, I am waiting for you.
Said Michael suspiciously. Wendy made a suggestion.
Why not take your medicines at the same time?
She counted to 3.
1, 2, 3, go!
Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling hid his glass behind his back. Michael let out a yell.
Not fair!
Wendy cried.
Oh, Father, I can't believe you did that.
Well, I meant to take mine, but I missed it.
Father said. John looked at his father sadly, and Nana left the room in disgust. Mr. Darling knew he had disappointed his children. He didn't like the way they were looking at him.
Let's play a joke on Nana.
He suggested.
I will pour my medicine into Nana's bowl. She will think it is milk. What fun!
He said, trying to be playful as he poured the medicine. When Nana returned, he patted her on the head.
Good dog.
He said.
Have a little milk from your bowl, Nana.
Nana wagged her tail and began to lap up the liquid. The children were shocked at their father's sense of humor. They didn't think his joke was funny at all. When the medicine was all gone, Nana shook her big head and crept into her doghouse to lie down. She did not look well. Mrs. Darling came back to a silent room. She looked at the unhappy group and the sick dog. Then she picked up Nana's bowl and sniffed it.
George, it's your medicine! How could you?
She cried.